The synthesizer locked at 04:12 station time, which is when Casson stopped looking at the patient and started looking at me. I was sitting in the corner of the med wing with the block on my knee, running the usual check, seal integrity, temperature strip, pouch inventory. I do it every morning. I've done it in worse places than Vorath Station, a pressurized crawler on a tailless slope at -40, a field tent with a cracked support strut, and a wind that made the whole thing sound like it was arguing with itself. The block and I have an understanding. It doesn't need attention the way the Vorath equipment did. It just needs the check. Casson said something to his colleague, Dorothy, younger, quieter, the one who had twice started to ask me something and twice decided against it. What Casson said, translated through the station's shared channel relay, came out approximately as, "The human is inventorying his supplies again." The tone implied this was quaint, like watching someone sharpen a stick. I closed the front pouch and moved to the second. Hundredth shelf isn't a pleasant posting. The plateau runs about 900 meters above the valley floor. The survey corridor is disputed by 3 separate colonial interest bodies, and the atmosphere is breathable but has the kind of particulate load that puts a faint gray tint on every surface by the end of the first week. Vorath Station had been established 8 months earlier as a joint emergency response facility, Vorath Biomedical Collective providing the hardware, the coalition providing a field liaison. I was the liaison. The coalition's idea of staffing a joint facility was, apparently, one person with a worn canvas kit and a thermos. I had been at Vorath for 11 days before the patient came in. His name was Sarandal, which is a coalition settler name, though by the time the survey team carried him through the station door he wasn't looking much like any file I'd seen. Saran had been born on Hundredth Shelf, a third-generation surface colonist, which meant his family had been breathing the plateau's air and eating what grew in its soil and working in its mineral light for 60 years. Vorath classification systems don't have a clean box for that. Coalition medical records have a half-dozen notations about long-term environmental adaptation, flag for specialist review, which is the bureaucratic way of saying nobody has quite gotten around to figuring out what 60 years of Hundredth exposure does to human biochemistry. The survey team laid him on the primary examination table and stepped back. Casson was already moving, his secondary researcher pulling up the synthesizer array, the overhead diagnostics blooming into their characteristic gold-white light across the ceiling. I stood up and walked over to look. Saran's breathing was shallow and irregular. His skin had the gray-purple undertone I'd seen in high-altitude pulmonary cases, but the survey team leader said there'd been a chemical exposure event. One of the survey corridor's contested extraction sites had vented something. He'd been the closest. He'd been on his feet for 6 hours before the tremors started. Casson ran the initial scan in about 40 seconds. The diagnostics painted a profile overhead, compound markers, cellular stress indicators, the cascade of inflammatory response across 3 tissue systems simultaneously. It was, I will admit, a thorough picture. The Vorath synthesis tower is not a simple machine. It takes a biological sample, reads every relevant genetic and biochemical marker in the subject's system, and produces a targeted intervention compound tailored to that specific profile. No guesswork, no broad-spectrum approximation. The Vorath are very proud of this. Casson turned to the synthesizer control panel and began entering parameters. I watched the patient and did a quiet count on his respiration. About 3 minutes in, Casson stopped entering parameters. He entered something else, then stopped again. Dorothy leaned in, read the screen, and said something I didn't catch on the relay. Casson answered. Then there was a pause that went on just long enough to mean something. I said, "Problem with the calibration." Casson didn't turn around. The system requires species marker confirmation before it will synthesize a treatment compound. Standard protocol. "Sure," I said. "Which markers is it looking for?" the patient's registered biological baseline. I looked at Sarin. He's human. He presents with human genetic markers, yes. He also presents with 47 secondary biomarkers inconsistent with any registered human population cohort. The system cannot confirm species parameters. It is initiating an extended calibration sequence. How long? Casson turned around then. He had the particular quality of stillness that senior Vorath researchers carry, all that precision and certainty compressed into a very small amount of movement. 6 hours, possibly 8. The calibration must resolve his profile against the full registry before synthesis can begin. The synthesizer does not operate on approximation. I nodded slowly, looked at Sarin, looked at my watch, looked at the inflammatory cascade still painting itself in gold-white light on the ceiling. 6 hours, I said. It is the protocol, Casson said. Your coalition field documentation notes the same patient flag for specialist review, long-term environmental adaptation, unresolved baseline. Your own system has not resolved it either. No, I said, it hasn't. I went back to the corner and picked up the block. Casson watched me carry it to the examination table. He had the expression, or the Vorath equivalent, which involves a very specific repositioning of the gold-banded rank markings along the jaw ridge, that indicated he was deciding whether to say something. He decided. What is that? Field kit, I said. I am aware it is a field kit. What do you intend to do with it? I unzipped the front pouch. Patients in acute inflammatory cascade across pulmonary, hepatic, and secondary vascular tissue. His respiration is declining. In 6 to 8 hours, the synthesizer will have a very clean profile of a man who has been hypoxic for 6 to 8 hours. The synthesizer requires confirmed parameters to avoid contraindicated compounds. Administration of an unvalidated compound to a patient with an unresolved biological profile could cause. Casson. I said his name the way you say a word when you want the other person to pause and listen for a moment without it being an argument. What's his blood oxygen right now? Casson glanced at the diagnostic display. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. 81, I said. I can read the display from here. I took out the first draw from the block, a flat sealed pack, dull orange, the kind of thing that looks deeply unimpressive next to a Vorath synthesis array. This is a compound the coalition has been using in high-altitude and mixed-exposure field scenarios for about 40 years. It is not targeted to his specific profile. It operates on the inflammatory pathway upstream of the tissue-specific response, which means it doesn't need to know exactly what his tissue-specific markers look like. It needs to know that he is a mammal with a carbon-based oxygen exchange system, which he is. Casson looked at the pack. The expression I had no clean translation for settled across his features. That, he said, is empirical guesswork. Yes, I said, it is. He held up one hand, not a threatening gesture, just the Vorath equivalent of a pause. You understand the risk profile of administering an unvalidated compound to a patient whose secondary biomarkers are unresolved. You cannot know how a non-targeted compound will interact with 47 markers your own species database has never classified. I know how it interacts with the upstream pathway, I said. That part is classified, thoroughly. You are proposing to treat a portion of the problem and hope the rest resolves. I'm proposing to treat the portion of the problem that is going to kill him in the next 4 hours, I said. The rest can wait for the synthesizer. There was a short silence. Vorath had stopped pretending to look at his datapad. Casson looked at the block again, the worn canvas, the color-coded pouches, the general appearance of something that had been repaired several times and didn't particularly care. I had the impression he was genuinely trying to find the right framing for what he was looking at. The Vorath Biomedical Collective trains its researchers on equipment with tolerances measured in hundredths of a microgram. The block's primary compound is measured in milliliters, estimated to body weight, with a margin of plus or minus 10% explicitly noted in the field manual as acceptable. These are not the same philosophy. Your coalition medical board approved this compound for field administration, Casson said. It was not quite a question and not quite an objection. More like a man reading a document he doesn't fully believe. 40 years ago, I said, and every review since. Based on what evidence base? 60,000 administrations, I said, give or take. He absorbed that, then, and you carry it in a canvas bag. I carry it in a canvas bag, I confirmed. I broke the seal on the pack and prepared the administration line. Vorath had moved to the other side of the table, quietly. I had the impression he was watching my hands more than the patient, which was interesting. Casson had not moved at all, which was also interesting. I administered the compound at 04:31 station time. Then I sat down on the stool next to the examination table and watched Saren breathe. Nobody talked for about 10 minutes. The diagnostic display cycled. The synthesizer continued its calibration, that faint harmonic hum it runs during extended sequences, like a large machine thinking carefully about something. Outside, the hundredth plateau did what it always does at this hour, which is glow a particular flat amber through the station's observation strip as the light comes sideways across the dust. Vorath said very quietly, his respiration rate is improving. I said. Casson said nothing. At the 40-minute mark, Saren's blood oxygen had climbed from 81 to 89. The inflammatory markers on the ceiling display were pulling back, not gone, not resolved, but no longer cascading. The acute phase was decelerating. His color had come back to something closer to what I'd expect from a tired man rather than a man running out of room. I took out the block's temperature strip and did a check. Casson came to stand beside the table at about the 50-minute mark. He studied the display for a while. He studied Saren. He studied the empty orange pack sitting on the equipment tray, which looked about as sophisticated as a sandwich wrapper next to his hardware. The upstream pathway suppression, he said. Your compound acts on the pathway before the tissue-specific cascade branches. Right. The synthesizer cannot do that. It is designed for targeted post-branch intervention. It requires the branch profile to be confirmed before it synthesizes. Right. So for a patient whose branch profile cannot be confirmed. It locks, I said, yes. Another pause. Vorath had quietly retrieved the empty pack from the tray and was reading the label. The label is not impressive. It lists the compound name, the batch number, the manufacturing date, and a coalition field medical authorization code. It does not explain the chemistry in any detail because it is designed to be read in low light by someone with cold hands who needs to know three things: what it does, when not to use it, and how much to give. Casson said, how long has the coalition been using this compound? 40 years, give or take. In what volume of cases? I thought about it. Coalition field medical alone, probably 60,000 administrations. You'd have to ask the medical corps for the civilian settlement numbers. And the efficacy rate. In acute inflammatory cascade with mixed or unresolved exposure profile, around 91% positive outcome at 48 hours post-administration. I paused. The synthesizer's targeted intervention, when it can calibrate, runs about 94. Casson absorbed this, 3 percentage points. 3 percentage points, I agreed, in exchange for not needing 6 hours to know who you're treating. Saren made a sound, not words, just a low exhale, the kind that means a person is coming back to themselves from somewhere unpleasant. His eyes moved under the lids. I leaned forward and put 2 fingers on his wrist. Pulse was steady, stronger than it had been at 04:12. I sat back and looked at the ceiling display for a moment, then at Casson. The synthesizer will still finish its calibration, I said. When it does, if sarin needs a targeted follow-up compound, you run it. The upstream suppression buys him the time for that to be useful. Casson looked at me for a long moment. Then at the block, sitting on the equipment tray with its pouches half unzipped and its orange packs lined up in their rows. Then back at me. You brought that kit because you expected the synthesizer would be unable to treat a hundredth surface colonist. I brought that kit, I said, because I bring that kit. He didn't say anything to that. Vorath had set the empty pack back down on the tray, very carefully, like he wasn't sure if it was evidence or an artifact. By 0700, Sarin was awake, irritable, and asking about his survey team in a way that suggested he was going to be fine. The synthesizer completed its calibration at 0847. Casson ran the targeted follow-up compound, which came out cleaner and more precise than anything I carry. A genuinely elegant piece of pharmaceutical engineering tailored to Sarin's exact profile, every branch mapped, every secondary marker accounted for. It was the right tool for what Sarin needed at 0847, when his acute phase was stable and the follow-up work could begin. At 0431, the right tool had been a flat orange pack with a batch number on it. Casson came to find me while I was restocking the block at 0930. I was in the supply corridor, cross-referencing the kit inventory against the station manifest, which is a slightly tedious process because the Vorath supply system categorizes compounds by synthesis pathway rather than application, and the two systems don't map cleanly. I had been at it for about 20 minutes. He stood in the corridor for a moment before he spoke. I am going to request, he said, that the Vorath Biomedical Collective Procurement Office review your coalition field compound for possible joint facility stocking. I looked up from the manifest. The synthesizer's calibration gap, he said, is not limited to hundredth surface colonists. Any patient presenting with an unresolved or mixed environmental adaptation profile will produce the same lock condition, given the survey corridor's colonial history. There are probably more Sarins out there, I said. Yes. I nodded and went back to the manifest. You were aware of the calibration gap before this morning, Casson said. It wasn't quite a question. The coalition's field briefing notes mention it, I said. Mixed exposure, long-term surface populations, synthesizer systems that require registered baseline confirmation. It's been a known mismatch for a while. And you said nothing about it when you arrived. I thought about how to answer that. I brought the block, I said. That was the thing to do. He stood in the corridor for another moment. I finished the manifest entry for the orange packs and moved on to the secondary pouch inventory. The compound, Casson said, what is it called? I told him, it's not a glamorous name. It sounds like someone named it quickly, which is probably what happened. 40 years ago, in a field tent on a cold plateau somewhere, somebody needed a name for the thing that worked and wrote down the first one that came to mind. It stuck. Casson repeated it carefully, then he left. Vorath appeared at the corridor entrance about 30 seconds later. He had the manner of someone who had been waiting for his senior colleague to clear the space. The survey team leader is asking about Sarin, he said. For the medical report, what should I list as the primary intervention compound? I told him the name again and spelled it out for the report. He wrote it down. Then he said, we were told coalition field mediators carry basic emergency supplies, triage stabilizers, standard analgesics. That's right, I said. That compound is not a triage stabilizer. No, I said, it's not. He nodded slowly. What else is in that kit? I looked at the block, then at Vorath. Quite a bit, I said. He looked like he had more questions. He probably did. He wrote something else in his report notes and thanked me and left. I finished the inventory, closed the block, and ran the temperature strip one more time. All green. I put it back on the shelf next to the station's wall-mounted emergency supply cabinet, which is a beautiful piece of equipment, backlit white, sealed titanium alloy, fully automated dispensing. Vorath inventory tracking system cross-reference to the station's central medical log in real time. It is, in every measurable specification, a superior storage solution. It was also not what I would reach for at 04:12 in the morning when a man I'd never seen before was breathing at 81%, and the synthesizer was thinking carefully about who he was. Saren was discharged 2 days later with a full compound prescription and a follow-up schedule. He shook my hand at the door, which is a hundredth settler habit. They pick it up from the first-generation colonists, and it sticks the way things do when families don't travel much. His grip was solid. He looked better than he had any right to look, given how the morning of his admission had started. "They tell me you used old-school field chemistry on me," he said. "Coalition standard," I said. He smiled in the way of a man who has been rescued by something unglamorous and feels fine about it. "My grandmother had one of those kits." "They haven't changed much," I said. He considered that for a moment, out there in the doorway with the flat amber light behind him. She said the same thing, said the coalition kept trying to replace it and kept going back to it. He squinted at the plateau. She thought that was funny. "It's a little funny," I said. He laughed and walked out into the amber hundredth morning, and that was that. 3 days after Saren left, I got a message from the Vorath Station Joint Administration Coordinator, a Vorath official I had communicated with exactly once, when I arrived, to sign the Shared Facility Access Agreement. The message informed me that Velkassin had submitted a formal technical notation to the Vorath Biomedical Collective's Field Equipment Review Board, citing the Vorath patient case as evidence of a systemic calibration gap in synthesizer deployment at mixed population survey sites. He had attached the case record and the compound data. He had not, the coordinator noted, consulted with me before submitting it, which the coordinator seemed to feel I should know. I sent back a one-line acknowledgement and went to run the block's morning check. The procurement request came through from the Vorath Biomedical Collective headquarters 6 weeks later. The block's primary compound, all 4 coalition variants, matched to different exposure profiles, was approved for joint facility stocking at 17 survey corridor stations. The approval document ran to 4 pages and used a great deal of language about cross-platform biochemical efficacy in non-standard patient cohort scenarios, which is a thorough way of saying it worked when the other thing couldn't start. I read the document on a Tuesday, made a note in my field log, and went to check on the block. Temperature strip was green. Inventory was full. The orange packs sat in their rows, looking exactly as unimpressive as they always had. I closed the pouch and got on with the morning,